Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matt Budd. I've been chairing the Financial Executives Networking Group for a little over 25 years. It's a labor of love for me, a little hobby. Hobby is, something you enjoy doing, you don't get paid for. I have a search practice. That's how I actually earn my living. What is unique about it is that I only recruit candidates for my assignments from members of the networking group. And a very significant percentage of my assignments come from members of the networking group. So I get to earn a living while talking to my friends all the time. So it's pretty cool. My background is before running the networking group and my search practice was advertising and publishing. During the 1980s, I was chief financial officer of an advertising agency in New York City, one of the top 50. Donald Trump was one of our clients, and unlike everybody else in the world, I did a surgical wallet removal on him and collected all my money. Before that, I was in the publishing business with when I was at CBS, their Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston division. And then my last corporate job was with the Thomson Corporation, now Thomson Reuters. The division I was with was headquartered in Eagan, Minnesota, where I was never moving. So I joined this little networking group, and I took over in December of '96, and I've grown the group from 60 people to around 37,000. We are the largest networking group of chief financial officers and controllers in the entire world. And hopefully we have a lot of folkways that make us a unique group. Our guest speaker for today is Jay Weiser of Jay Weiser Consulting. And we're going to be talking about disruption. And if there's anything that's happening right now, however you want to call it, it's extreme disruption. So I always let my speakers introduce themselves and their background, because for some reason, they always do a much better job of it than I do. I don't know why that is. Maybe Jay has an answer. Jay, are you ready?
Yes, sir. Thank you for...
Hey, welcome to Chat with Matt.
Thank you for having me on, and I really appreciate the chance to speak to a group of CFOs. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I have had a lifelong passion for problem solving, and I probably have asked why pretty frequently since my parents say I was about 2 or 3. And my wife will tell you that really hasn't stopped, and my kids as well. It's always been about finding out the story behind the numbers and how do I help companies become more successful? How do I help leaders reach their full potential? In doing that, the first thing for me is always about understanding the environment they're in and context. And that's also something I'm interested in, because the environment's really important to understand. And that's been important since between 2000 and 2010, I worked for a firm called the Palladium Group. Some of you might have known it as Balanced Scorecard Collaborative. And there I worked with Doctors Kaplan and Norden of Balanced Scorecard fame, and worked from middle market to Fortune 500 companies. And it was all about how do you help these companies manage and execute strategy? And that was really taking a holistic picture of the organization. And over the last, certainly the last several years, the pace of disruption and of change has accelerated, I think beyond any of our beliefs. And I'm talking even pre-COVID, just in terms of technology change with what customers want, change in what competitors are doing. You can talk about the Amazon effect. And sure. There's also been, from a customer perspective, if I think companies have gone from being firm-centric, looking inside at themselves, to being more customer-centric. And that's really been something that's driven a lot of value. So, what brings me here today
let's talk about what the heck's going on. This is apparently, in your thinking, not the first time something's been disrupted.
I'm sorry, just repeat that, Matt.
I said this is apparently, in your thinking, not the first time something's been disrupted.
No, I mean, it's been happening. You can go back, when you and I talked, we talked about the BlackBerry. BlackBerry's gone. Blockbuster's gone.
Yeah.
Kodak's almost gone.
Well, Kodak isn't the same company anymore. No, people didn't know it, but they were a chemical manufacturing company.
Yep.
They weren't really they thought they were in the photography business. And of course, there's no money in photography anymore.
Well, and now they've gone back to their roots, back in the chemical business.
Yeah, they're a chemical manufacturer. I don't know how many original employees they have, but that's what they really do. And they were pretty good at it.
Got a little diverted with the photography. But, so disruptions have been occurring for a long time. And companies, I've seen always.
Sorry to interrupt you, but nothing quite like this. This is more like war, isn't it?
Well, I mean, you think about 9/11, you think about the economic collapse, 2008. I mean, all of those were, big systemic changes. Granted, this has brought a bunch of things together all at once. Between the pandemic, the social effect, the economic effect, technology has had to change. The level of adaptation has that we've been called to do is extreme.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also something, I don't think this is the first time that this is going to happen. I think there are going to be other disruptions. And this has just brought to our attention that some of these things have worldwide effects. I mean, you think about climate change, you think about terrorism, you think about, other economic or trade issues, political issues. And, people say sometimes, what I find interesting is that this was a black swan. Nobody saw it coming. But the reality is, people did see it coming. People did talk about it.
Yeah. It
was not something that people didn't foresee, but it was something that people didn't pay attention to. Yeah. And didn't.
There were companies that we could cite that have done reasonably well since COVID started, but they were prepared for something else, and it just happened to work out. I would cite, for example, many of the people who are in the brokerage business. They were prepared for another 9/11 and were able to decentralize overnight. They had no idea it was because they were going to have to empty out their offices.
What I was going to say is, I think, if we take those lessons from past disruptions, I mean, some companies have chosen to, we did that before. They got much more focused on financial results, efficiency, high levels of productivity. They forget what happened before in a lot of cases. And then all of a sudden, something happens. And they're starting from scratch all over again because they didn't retain that knowledge. They didn't retain those lessons. And, this idea, when I talk about preparedness and resilience, that is not for a specific risk. It's a base level of preparedness and resilience that you can develop in your organization that will make you more prepared and ready and resilient, whatever the disruption is. Now, you never, ever going to have a vaccine that's 100%. But if you think about the flu vaccine, it's effective 70, 80% of the time. If you get the flu, you don't get as serious of a case. And I think it's the same thing with preparedness and resilience.
I would agree with you. The classic, I'm a big time sailor. So the classic thing is not to be dead. Okay. I mean, really, that doesn't work. One of the rules, there's 3 rules on the boat. Don't fall overboard. Don't fall overboard. And for God's sake, don't fall overboard. As long as you're with the boat, you are much better off. See, you have to prepare for these things. And if something does happen out on the water, no one is coming to your rescue, not within the time that you need it to happen. So you have to prepare for your own survival. And I don't know that companies do this as actively. Perhaps you'd like to talk about some of the clients you worked with, without naming them, of course,
Sure.
somewhat prepared for this.
Well, I've done work in the supermarket industry. And while they might not have been prepared for the pandemic and they might have been shocked, the supermarket business in the Southeast, if you think about Home Depot, you think about Lowe's, some of the national chains, they have hurricanes down like the back of their hand, because they know when they see the signals of a hurricane coming in, they know they have to start to reposition water, they have to reposition lumber, they have to reposition generators, and they have a playbook that they can follow.
Yeah, well, that's the key, right? Having a playbook.
I'm sorry.
I said that's the key, having a playbook.
Well, having a playbook, or at least a skeleton of a playbook that you can go back to. There are core things. My wife's in education, and they always had a phone tree. So if something happened, they had a system set up to get information out to all the teachers and all the parents. That's one level of preparedness.
Okay.
And people had, certain roles.
They had what?
Everyone had a certain role.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I think putting together a playbook, it educates everybody in the leadership team with how things actually work. I think I have seen there's a lot of people who do what they do, but they don't know what everybody else does.
And I think, to that end, we used to call it cross-training, but I think the next step beyond cross-training is more of this cross-functional collaboration. If you think about the different silos for a minute, hopefully we can get rid of the silos. But if somebody, I used to talk, if I was facilitating a group of executives, and there was a company I was doing work for outside of Chicago, and they were in the textbook business, college bookstore business. And I remember a meeting and the sales exec had rated his objectives green, but he had been under target for 2 quarters in a row. And I remember having the discussion with him and raising it in the meeting. And he's like, I don't want to talk about this now. I don't want to talk about it. It's like, no. This is the meeting with all the executive team. And what I said to him is, everybody's on a boat. We're all on the same boat. The fact that the hole's under your seat really doesn't matter, because if I'm sitting on the other side and I'm saying, oh, that's your problem, well, I'm going down with the boat too.
Yeah.
So I talked about dual citizenship. So you're a citizen of your function, but you're also a citizen of your company. So you have to wear that general management hat as well. And you have to adapt, and you've got to be flexible, because if you're stuck in that silo and you get caught in a situation like this, your perceived value compared to folks who are more attuned across function, they're going to be rated high value and you won't be. And that's not a position you want to be in.
I think I interrupted you. You were starting to talk about the hyper focus on efficiency and productivity, and and some examples perhaps of how that has affected us today. Maybe in the hospitals, maybe you can talk about that.
Well, you think about the pandemic now. I remember listening to one of Governor Cuomo's, one of his daily briefings.
Yeah.
And somebody asked him and said, why didn't New York have more ventilators? And he said, that's a really good question. He said, but a year or two ago, the legislature was pushing us to reduce taxes, cut our budget. Yeah. He said, and if I came in and said, I want to buy 500 ventilators just in case, he said, I would have been laughed out of Albany. Now, if he was to say that now, he'd probably be taken a little more seriously. Might not get 500, but it's that same focus.
Yeah.
If again, I'll go back to a supermarket example. Supermarkets operate on a very thin margin. So
Yeah.
labor productivity is important, efficiency in supply chain, staffing, all these things. And the thing is, if you're that hyper focused on efficiency, the first thing to go are things like training, things like preparedness, things like any kind of backup systems or redundancy, because if things are going great, you're going to make buckets of money. But like I told my son when he was learning to drive, I said, if you go over a pothole at 10 miles an hour, it'll bump, but there won't be a whole lot of damage. You won't get hurt. I said, if you go over the same pothole and you go like 90 miles an hour, bad things happen. And that's the same thing. These companies were running at such high speed and high efficiency.
Yeah.
There's
basically no inventory, right? What we used to call inventory, because everything is on just in time.
I mean,
any little bump in the road happens, boom, everything can stop.
Well, and it's inventory, certainly. I mean, we saw that in the supermarkets, but it's also people. It's how stretched are your people if they're operating at 120% because of their workloads, and all of a sudden something changes, something has to give.
Yeah.
And
it's always quite a balance. I mean, in the world of politics, of course, everybody's a Monday morning quarterback. But you and I discussed what happened in Atlanta a few years ago when there was a freak snowstorm, and the mayor at the time was taken to task for not having enough snow plows. But of course, it never really snows in Atlanta. Why would he have snow plows? And he would have been taken to task if he had 50 of them sitting around, would he not?
Well,
they voted out of office.
And it's interesting. That was after that happened, the whole area was gun shy for a couple of years. If there was a threat of flurries, the schools were let out early just in case.
Yeah.
A threat of flurries, people ran to the supermarket and stripped out all the shelves.
Yeah. One of my little jokes is, if a storm's coming in, I told my wife, we should really go out and get some cigarettes. But then I remember I don't smoke.
That's a good one. Hey, something I think that's really important. So when people are talking about efficiency and productivity, they're talking about ultimately getting financial value.
Yes.
What's interesting.
That's what we do as CFOs. We have to maximize the value.
The numbers, but a CFO should also be concerned about risk and paying attention to, are those dollars, those cash flow, that customers, markets, are they at risk? And when you think about a company that's more resilient, more prepared, there are a couple of things that happen.
Okay.
One, they anticipate problems earlier because they've talked about them. They've looked at different scenarios. They've asked those what if questions. So they have an advantage of time. If you think about going back to that hurricane, if you're Home Depot or Lowe's, you're not waiting till 2 days before it hits the coast. You've been watching it for a week or two. Right. So that's kind of that.
And in their world, these are normal business things that they need to be prepared for, because everyone's counting on them.
And those
are they not? They're counting on them to have enough sheets of plywood to board up windows.
Well, and the thing is, these are things that are high impact and high probability risks. So, those are things you must do things for. But then you think about tornadoes, for example. You don't get a whole lot of notice about a tornado.
Sometimes you get 10 minutes.
But people still prepare. You never know when it's going to happen. but
Sure.
my kids know where to go in the basement. If you're in the Midwest, you might have a tornado cellar. There are certain things that you would not think not to have. Now, I grew up in Rhode Island. No reason to have a tornado shelter, not usually,
Right.
but in different places. So one is about anticipating things and looking for things earlier. So you're not just so narrowly focused, but you're looking broadly. Same thing for a company, in terms of things going on with competitors, weak signals that might be around you that you might want to track or monitor. I think the other thing, when a company's more prepared, more resilient, when you get hit with a disruption, if you're not resilient, you are going to get slammed. You're going to get knocked over. It's going to be far worse because that downside effect gets amplified. On the other hand, if you are more resilient, you'll get knocked off, but you're going to get back quick. You have that cushion. You can absorb the blow and move on.
Yeah. I think however, there are lots of circumstances where there's just absolutely nothing you can do. If you take the cruise line industry, for example, the fact that people on board a ship many of whom could get sick, is not an unknown risk. Correct?
Right.
So that part of it, I think the cruise lines should have been somewhat prepared for a disaster. They've had experiences with food poisoning, right? On board ship. They've had outbreaks of the flu because they're dealing with an elderly clientele, perhaps.
Sure.
But to be closed for business for a year is not something. What do you do about that? Is there anything in your mind as the senior planner in our group here today? What can you do about something like that? Are these things so extreme that there's just nothing you can do?
I think in those cases, I was going to say lines of credit. You can have some financial cushion, some wherewithal to be able to weather through the storm. I mean, the fact of the matter is they're not sailing. And the boats, as you reminded me when we spoke, still cost money to, keep them workable.
They have to be put somewhere.
There are things, like they do with the airline industry, they take planes out of the system. Sometimes those planes are permanently out of the system.
Well, when they know storms are coming in, they move planes because they don't want them destroyed on the ground. They do have some planning. Well, we don't have to spend a lot of time on things that, like a meteorite hits the earth. I mean, when those things happen, everybody's going to get hurt.
Yeah, I mean,
there may be nothing you can do about it, but as CFOs, I think we need to focus on reasonable business risks. Out to 3 standard deviations, we should be thinking about what might happen and planning for it.
And there's things that have lower likelihood but high impact. Those are the things you need to pay attention to.
That's what I was alluding to earlier about falling overboard. You don't want to do that. That's high risk. And I'm sorry, what was it? How did you refer to it?
No, I'm sorry, just repeat the last part.
How did you refer to it? You refer to it as high impact and.
Well, for the individual, it's high impact.
Yeah, right. So, we have people will have new words about sailing to use in their conversations with other people. There are things that you can put on your boat called jack lines. It's a line that runs from the back of the boat to the front of the boat. And I wear when I'm out, I'm an old man. So I wear a harness at all times and I'll built in an inflatable life jacket. And when I go out on deck, I clip on because I want to be with the boat.
Right.
Okay. Because to your point, there are some things that you can't fix, like if you fall overboard and drown. That's the end of it, right?
Sure.
You want to at least be attached to the boat. So, in terms of business, There are lots of things that just, you run out of cash and you can't make payroll. That's a big problem when no one comes in on Monday morning, and you're going to be blamed for it.
But that's not just a pandemic. I mean,
Yeah.
you could have that same cash shortfall because you've been disrupted. All of a sudden you find out that, let's say you're in the lettuce business or Chipotle, and now there's E. coli going around. So there can be, any mix of disruptions. I mean, in this case, it happens to be going on for an indeterminate amount of time. And it's not just, so if you think about a hurricane, for example, a hurricane has a beginning and a hurricane has an end. So a lot of disruptions have beginnings and ends. In this case, we don't know when it's going to end. And we don't know what the ultimate outcome is going to be in terms of what changes carry on.
Yeah. Well, there are businesses that are that you really wouldn't want to be in right now, like the theater business, the cruise line business, the airline business, perhaps not so much because planes are still flying, but you still have to plan. Maybe there's other industries you'd like to cite here, Jay.
Well, excuse me. If you think about the conference business, people aren't going to conferences.
Right.
So, the question for something like that, are there alternative businesses they can get into? Virtual conferences. So when this whole thing started with companies did virtual conferences, different speakers, stuff was for free. And it was to get people engaged. Now, a lot of these conferences, whether it be on strategy, whether it be on customer experience, now they're charging. Now they might not be charging what they did for an in-person.
Right, but they don't have any of the expenses of an in-person.
Right. But in that case, they've adapted. Now the question becomes, will that conference business come back? Or will that industry forever be changed and have to be potentially on a hybrid model?
Yeah, if you're in that business, putting on conferences, you need to be thinking and planning right now. I can tell you our networking group was very fortunate that only about 30% of our members ever went to in-person events. We really are sort of a virtual organization. And I have very smart people who chair our chapters, and within a matter of days, they had Zoom licenses. We already had many meetings that we were wiring in people around the country on telephone lines. The adoption cycle on Zoom was like 3 days. It was amazing. I related to somebody that the adoption cycle on email was more like 5 or 6 years.
Yep.
On Zoom, it was like less than 3 weeks, right? We adapted our model to service our members overnight, and we don't know what the answer is to your question about the event business and when we're going to be back shaking hands and passing out business cards. Who knows? We have a year now to get through.
I'm just making myself 2 notes. I bring this up.
Yeah, please.
So first of all, you
never know where discussions go, Jay.
No, but I mean, you talk about the speed of adaptation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Some companies, I know my wife works for the county school system. They had to, within a week, they had to get online. This was never something they had planned for, but they were able to get things up and running quickly. Now, it might not have been the highest quality, but the point is they got themselves up and operating. And, same thing what you talked about with Zoom. Zoom as a company had to scale. Now, one of the things that's interesting is when you have a disruption, all of a sudden the weak links start to come up. So for Zoom, it was security issues that all of a sudden became very visible that they had to address. And with the pandemic, if you think about hospital staffing, you think about surge capacity, where they might have had for a mass casualty event, but they needed to start to think about these things, and the companies that could flex faster and adapt faster, because again, those are the ones that are going to be more prepared, more resilient. And that's having an advantage. Now, I've talked about three so far. That as a CFO, there's value to anticipating better and faster, because that means there's less risk to your money and there's still money coming in. This idea about having a cushion so you're able to withstand the shock, that has value. If I'm a shareholder, I want to know that the company I would think, especially now, that the company I'm investing in is more resilient. Because if the companies keep on toppling over, I'm going to go to companies I have more confidence in. And if you think about the speed and the ability to adapt quickly, time is money.
Sure.
And that's also very valuable.
Yeah, so this might be a good place to talk about the web of impacts.
So the thing, so I guess, the key point to take away from the web of impacts is that so many things are interrelated and interconnected. They don't just hit one thing. So, I mean, if you think about the pandemic, it started off as being a physical disease. People were getting sick, but that had economic effects because now people can't go to work. That had technology effects because all of a sudden you were working from home. Your kids might have been in school and at home. I know at my house, everything, we started losing connections and things like that. We didn't have enough bandwidth. So we had to increase the bandwidth. That had economic consequences. My Comcast bill went up. When we did our grocery shopping, delivery services, all of a sudden Instacart became one of the most important functions or, companies for so many people who are getting delivery or Uber Eats and those sorts of things. When you think about other types of things, go back to 9/11. 9/11 impacted the travel industry. 9/11.
I think everybody's kind of forgotten how easy it used to be to get on a plane. And overnight, everything changed.
Well, and it took, I don't think people, let me back up. I know when I was traveling in the years after that, 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I was like hyper aware of what was going on around me and paying attention in the warnings. But as time goes on, I wasn't paying as much attention and it seemed much more remote. So it dissipates. Right now people are being, for the most part, extra careful in their social distancing. But as time goes on, people are like, oh, I've been doing this for so long. If I do this a little, some of this is also around vigilance and sticking with it. And I think that's important too. When you think about preparedness and resilience, it's not something you do once. It's being steadfast in having a more resilient and prepared posture. Because, if you let it slide, something's bound to happen. And you might think, well, that's not going to happen now. But you have to maintain that vigilance, which is also important.
Yeah, I think this is a sea change in many respects. I think, as we've discussed on a previous call we had, I don't think anything's going back to what we used to call normal anytime soon. And if it's over 2 weeks from the time things are going back to normal, I would do some planning on how we're going to cope.
Well, and the thing is, we're not going back to normal.
Yeah, that's going to be a tough one for people to accept, don't you think?
it's the reality, and I think back, do I want to go back to normal? Well, what was normal? Normal for us was a country that was unprepared, businesses that were unprepared. We were very fragile. Now, as a result of what's gone on, there have been a lot of positives. E-commerce has grown, video conferencing has grown, and we're finding out we're innovating faster, we're adopting some new things faster.
Yeah, so it's almost been good that the pace of change had picked up so much speed in the last 10 to 15 years, because we've learned to adapt quickly, perhaps.
Well, and the thing is, you don't want to go backwards. You want to go forwards. So instead of, getting back to normal, I think it's moving forward to what is the next normal, because there's never, what's the saying, that the only certainty is uncertainty. So even when we think about that next normal, that's only going to be for a period of time. I use the term temporary permanence. And what that means is there are things that are temporarily permanent. Food delivery was huge at the beginning of the pandemic, and it was temporarily permanent, and then it kind of dissipated. Now, it'll probably come back as the virus starts to surge, as it's surging now, that people might go back to doing a lot more delivery.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that within our networking group, 25 years ago, the very idea that you would be out of work and wouldn't get back to a permanent job was a concept that people had trouble holding in their minds. So I came up with this thing that I tell people: you're never actually working, you're only between searches.
That's true.
This is what I try to tell people, because once you hit middle age, you're no longer working for large companies. Large companies grow their own. You're working for middle market companies, and they fall into two broad categories: good ones and bad ones. The good ones get acquired and the CFO gets fired. The bad ones go out of business and the CFO gets fired. It's not you, but to get people to accept in their lives this new normal, we came up with little mantras like that to keep people focused on what the real problems are. So why don't you, we have 20 minutes left. Why don't you talk, there is a chat box if people have specific questions, but why don't we talk about the CFO's role in all of this?
Sure.
Because that's the audience.
As a CFO, so first of all, I'm not a CFO, so I'll state that up front.
I wasn't going to say anything.
But I've worked with CFOs, I've worked with CIOs. I know the language. I joke I'm multilingual. I can speak finance, HR, IT, enough to get myself in trouble. I was also in corporate lending early on. So for a CFO, one of your responsibilities under SOX is enterprise risk management. And I would go out and say, more than just risk management is thinking about resilience and preparedness management. It's one thing to list out all the risks. The other thing is, what are you really prepared for? So companies are really good about business continuity. They know what to do if there's a security breach. They know what to do if there's a building fire. But when it comes to, uninsurable events like a pandemic, like a change in customer behavior, a new technology, preparedness is the insurance. Resilience is the insurance. So I think that's going to become a bigger and bigger topic. CFOs, I think, company shareholders, not just CFOs, are understanding that there is a price to hyper efficiency and hyper productivity.
Yeah, I don't think that was well recognized prior to this. It was always low inventories and just-in-time inventories, and you don't want to have any more people than you absolutely need. that has consequences. I think the way I've always seen the role of the CFO, and you can comment on this, is that he's the only one who actually knows what everything costs. So if he doesn't have a good economic model of the company in his brain at all times, he does see the whole picture, or should. And unlike the CEO, who sees the whole picture but doesn't know what everything costs, that's a big difference. What's the cost of some resilience, to your point, in the company? Why don't you build on that? Where do we, as a CFO, how do we beat everybody up and tell them, yeah, we should spend some money on that?
Yeah, I think first of all, you got to go beyond the numbers. What's the saying? Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that you can count counts.
Mhm.
So I think, I was talking earlier about what's the value of being resilient in terms of its value. It's not just value protection. So it's different than insurance. Insurance protects you against a loss.
Yeah.
Resilience dampens the loss, but it amplifies the upside, because now you're more able to compete. You can take advantage of companies that were not prepared. So there's value there. Now, can you put an actual dollar figure on it? Like, you can do a rough estimate, and you can ballpark costs. I think the other thing too that's important for a CFO and the entire leadership team to do is you can't start out with a plan and you have a fixed set of assumptions and you assume for the next 3 years, revenue is going to go up like this, and that things are static.
Mhm.
That's not happening anymore. It shouldn't have happened before. So I think now there needs to be more scenario planning. There needs to be more stress testing. I remember as a corporate lender, one of the things we were asked to do is what would break the loan? What would make it go bad?
Sure.
I did work with a nursing home chain, and they were projecting this amazing growth, the states they were going to go into, they were going to get more private pay, so on and so forth. Well, they went into states that had poor reimbursement policies. Private pay ultimately runs out.
Yeah.
The rates they weren't getting, places were getting overpopulated. So the point being, you have to challenge those assumptions. You've got to ask, what if something would happen? What if I lost my most important customer? What if what I think customers are going to want changes? And not every scenario is worth protecting for, but you're going to start to see which ones are. And I think the other part of that too, for a CFO, what are the drivers of your business? Because not everything is equal. And I think when you think about risk and you look at the drivers, so if I'm in the supermarket business, supply chain is a driver. What are the risks to my supply chain, and what do I need to consider? Because even if you weren't preparing for a pandemic, there were a lot of things that happened to supply chain. It's truckers strike, a supplier going down. So should have been thinking about that. And these are, questions to ask instead of just taking something for granted and saying, oh, Mr. XYZ business line, thank you for, sending over your business plan.
Yeah.
Without it being challenged and tested.
Yeah. So out in the world of things that everybody kind of knows about now, the hospital CFOs really did a terrible job in terms of their lines of business and the margins on them. Everybody thought that they could take a lower price from the government, and all of a sudden all they have is government business, and all the elective surgeries they were making a lot of money on are gone, and now they're running out of cash. Well, duh. These are the people who don't pay you quickly. These are the people who take you to the cleaners on every rate. You can't really you can't lose money at variable cost and make it up in volume.
Sure. Well,
You do know that, right?
yes.
The
Well,
proverbial hot dog vendor who loses money at variable cost, but he's going to make it up in volume. You can't do that. And I think the hospitals actually, they were trying to do that. They thought, this is incremental business. We don't have to make as much money on it. Now suddenly it's their whole plate. Before we get too far along, I mean, unless you have a comment on that, somebody brought up a question about culture.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean,
I think that's a good question for you to,
I think that's
before we run out of time.
I think there were a couple of good questions I was going to say. I was wondering, what role do you think culture plays in resilience? Jay?
sure. So I think, first of all, beyond culture and resilience, I think you have to talk about culture in terms of safety, in terms of openness. So if you're in an environment where control is very hierarchical, people only get information on a need to know basis.
Yeah.
And stuff isn't being communicated. People don't understand the strategy or the purpose of the company. Those places are more at risk. So culture comes into play if, for example, this whole pandemic thing, we've never dealt with something like this before. So it's important for leaders to recognize they don't know everything and engaging with people they might not have engaged with before, and seeing that there's value in having that openness and having a more flexible organization. So I think some cultures are going to change. And I think there are cultures where the business is going to be hurt because of that very culture. And until that light bulb goes off and people say, oh, I made a mistake, I probably should have listened to my frontline people more, that's when change starts to happen. And I think with something like the pandemic is a perfect time, because now that things are all broken up, that you have a chance to put things back together in a way that's going to be more effective, that's going to help you with future disruptions.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, Jay, is that top-down management styles, people down the food chain know what to do, but they don't necessarily know why. And the why is very important.
Well,
of course, if they ask you, you'll say why, because that's what you do.
Well,
right?
I think the other
day you were telling us about why.
Yes.
Why?
Well, the other thing too, when you think about culture, there are companies that are very firm centric. So if I think about Spirit Airlines, their whole business is about how can I get customers, if we're going to get lowest prices, we're not getting any frills, we're not doing the basics. Spirit is all about efficiency and productivity.
Okay.
And, I don't think they're thinking about customer service versus companies that are more customer centric. And if you're going to be able to deliver to your customers, your frontline people have to be treated right, because if they're not treated right, they're not going to treat the customer right. So again, if you have a culture that is counter to your strategy, and you have something like the pandemic, that shines a spotlight on it. And you can't hide those weaknesses anymore.
Yeah, it's very important. Well, just 1 second. We have a local grocery chain in Connecticut called Stu Leonard's, and they have in stone at the front of as you come into the door, it says the rule here: the customer is always right. 2, if the customer is wrong, see rule 1.
Yep.
So everybody in the store knows the customer is always right. That's what they do. And if you get something home and it's spoiled, you bring it back. They don't question it because the customer is always right. It's very simple business, right?
No, exactly. I mean,
I think Peggy has another question for us.
Right. I was going to comment, Jay, on what you were saying, and saying that I think you're talking about the importance of communication and transparency, and that with resilience, you would have to say, if we are communicating transparency, then we would understand what we have to do regarding risk, because everybody was on board to understand what was happening. And that sort of goes to a question that somebody asked earlier, that why, they said, why are you looking at the worst case scenario risk? Why aren't you focusing on sort of middle, mid-risk problems to be resilient? And then obviously, if you have to go to worst case, you're already at that midpoint. What is your comment on that?
Yeah.
So first of all, I'd agree with you 100%. I mean, this conversation has, been focused more on the extremes. But as I said early on, there have been disruptions going on for a long time
Sure.
that, you can't now even compare in magnitude to the pandemic, but that uncertainty and those disruptions were happening. So, I think part of this is, first of all, it's not just the job of the CFO to be risk aware and thinking about resilience. It's everybody's job, whether you're in marketing, whether you're in logistics. And it's the run of the mill things that tend to be highly likely and have some degree of impact, some higher impact, some lower. And you have to look at, again, going back to the drivers of your business, is protect the things that are most important to driving value for the company and for your customers. So it's not just the big things. You have to do the work for the small things as well.
But let's go back to the worst case scenario. I would tell you from a sailor's point of view, the worst case scenario is falling overboard because you're dead. Right? And in a company's context, I think you do need to do worst case scenario planning, because otherwise you're out of business. Arthur Anderson, right?
Well,
they didn't do any worst case scenario planning, and they got their license pulled, and then it turned out, oh, sorry, it wasn't really that bad.
One of the things,
right?
Yeah, one of the things I said earlier is no one could have prepared perfectly for the pandemic. But you can have a base level of resilience and preparedness with things like information sharing, transparency, clarity around strategy, more distributed decision making. All of these things help companies be more nimble, help companies be more responsive.
Yeah. I think companies also have a responsibility to their customers. Apropos the discussion you had about Home Depot and Lowe's, where they see a storm is coming, they don't wait for customers to call them. They know their customers are going to be calling them. They've done this before. Maybe not at that store, but if they look at the total span of their customer base, they've seen it before somewhere.
Well, and the thing, it goes back to being proactive. I have trees around my house. It's prudent for me to trim those trees. So I have insurance that'll cover me for, damage from a hurricane or a tornado. But there are small things that I, just as a matter of course, you do maintenance, you do preventative things you have a smoke detector, a carbon monoxide detector, you have fire extinguishers in your house. Those are all things you can do. That's kind of the day-to-day thing. So you don't have the big disaster of your, entire house burning down. Yeah.
So, this kind of leads, we're 6 minutes out from ending, but, this whole idea of being aware of what's going on around you. We talk in our group, of course, since everybody's looking for work from time to time, on reinventing yourself. And the kind of related to that is this quote that Bruce Janowski sent to us about Albert Einstein: in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. There are opportunities. The whole world has been disrupted. If we want to stand here deer in the headlights, that's fine. but there are still ways of making money, even in the worst possible circumstances, with the resources that you have at your firm. Unless, of course, you're in the cruise line business, then you're screwed.
Well, I think that goes to a question I was going to ask you, Jay. I think that I see resilience very much linked to flexibility. And so if you can't be resilient if you're not flexible, whether it's in your thinking or in your culture, that you can't just have, this is the way we do it, this is the way we've always done it. How would you respond?
So so I think what we're comparing is flexibility and resiliency. So the first thing I'd say is you can't be resilient if you're not flexible. But being flexible does not mean you're resilient, because resilience goes to a variety of different things. In terms of organizational resilience, in terms of technical resilience. And it's not just being flexible, it's knowing the right things to do. You need to understand your strategy. Plenty of companies are flexible, but they're not necessarily doing the right things because they don't understand the purpose and where the company's trying to go. So I think context comes in. It's also about future thinking. So it's knowing what kind of flexibility you need, what kind of capabilities do you need to develop.
I think it's also important to know what flexibilities you have. A good planning structure. One of my little jokes is that I'm very good at in the box thinking. I know I like to think about what's in the box that I can use perhaps for something else. And I think there are companies out there who they do one thing, but they have the resources to do other things that are more valuable now that COVID-19 has hit.
So let me throw something out there. And you think about capability development. People who are in between jobs versus in between searches, or even if they're in between searches. If you're a CFO, there are different skills that I think they were important before. There's a spotlight on them now and are more important in terms of how you think, what you challenge, the story behind the numbers, the story going forward about what is that future going to look like. We don't know what's going to happen when we get a vaccine. We don't know if people are going to want to go back to restaurants as quickly. It's not all of a sudden that's going to happen. So it's up to the CFO to be thinking more about the future, not just looking backwards. And it's important, this idea of having a learning and curious mindset, because experience and expertise, the fact that you've been a CFO for 30 years did not prepare you for this. And in some cases, I'd say if you're relying on that expertise and experience, you're at a disadvantage versus someone who has been learning and is more flexible and is able to change.
Yeah, I think where we are now, and you can comment on this, is that we can't, as CFOs, afford to be deer in the headlights right now. There is going to be some future, and we may not know what it is, but we need to sit down and do some scenario planning on how we're going to survive.
Well, that's great, because somebody put in the chat box a quote from Eisenhower, and it was, "The plan is nothing, planning is everything." Goes right to what you were saying.
Yeah, the planning process itself, I think you would agree, Jay, is what makes it possible to be resilient.
Well, yes, I think planning, and I'll also say something else, preparing. So, you and I think I said this to you, I think preparing is the new planning, because it's very hard to plan today. because you don't know what that environment's going to be, but you can be better prepared. And that helps you ultimately plan more effectively. But I think right now preparedness is more and more important.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're out of our time right now. I want to thank you so much for being on Chat with Matt. I think everybody got a whole lot out of this, and we're going to try to find more speakers in the future who have something to say. Jay, you were absolutely terrific. We had a very wide-ranging and engaging conversation about disruption. This meeting has been recorded. If you want to let people who were unable to attend about it, we'll be putting it up on our YouTube channel. If you just go to YouTube and type in the Financial Executives Networking Group, you'll get our YouTube channel. We have a few jewels out there for you to that you might have missed for you to review. And again, I want to thank everybody for joining us on Chat with Matt. Stay safe. I guess wash your hands, and let's hope things start getting better.
Wear a mask.
Wear a mask, right? I forgot
Yes.
about that. Wear a mask, wash your hands, and please stay away from crowds, okay? We want all of you here in the months to come for more Chats with Matt. God bless you all.
Stay home. If you stay home, then you're ready for Chat with Matt.
Exactly. All right. God bless everybody, and we'll see you on the next Chat with Matt.